Are you trying to establish your brand as a thought leader? Start a podcast, invite industry experts to be guests on your show, and watch your brand become the prime resource for decision makers in your industry. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show. All right, welcome back to the Behind the Curtain series of B2B Growth. My name is James Carberry. I'm joined today by Logan Lyles, our Director of Partnerships. Logan, how are you, man?
What's up, man? I am fantastic.
So we had a conversation with a good friend of ours, Rex Biberston, and he mentioned something to us. He said, man, you guys have a really weird sales problem. And we're going to be talking about that a little bit today, kind of what that problem is and what we are doing to fix it. I thought that was this conversation would be really good, Logan, for this particular series, because this is what Behind the Curtains is all about, really talking about how we're growing, the issues we're facing as we're trying to scale this business, our podcast agency. And so I thought this would be fantastic content. So unpack for us kind of your conversation with Rex, and we'll go from there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Rex and I were talking one sales guy to another, and a common debate, especially in B2B sales, is where's the balance right now between automation and manual personalization, especially in email sequences. So Rex and I were kind of riffing on that. I was asking him for some advice because he and his team do a phenomenal job of sales development for folks, put out a lot of great content on sales development. So I was picking his brain a little bit and telling him a little bit about here's where I automate, here's where I'm doing manual touches, these sorts of things. And here's kind of where I'm struggling to get next steps, not necessarily get next steps, but figure out where is that balance in productivity and effectiveness for me, balancing this, manual personalization and automation. And several minutes into the conversation, he said, wait, we're not talking about your first touch. And I said, no, where I am asking for your advice on is to get the follow-up meetings, to get responses after the initial sales call. And he said, well, I'm a little bit in the dark here because so often I'm giving people advice on this topic as it relates to securing the first meeting, not when it comes to securing follow-up meetings or securing next steps.
And so the reason why we don't have a problem getting that first meeting is, I think, really interesting. Can you elaborate on a couple of the reasons why we are running into this weird sales problem?
Yeah, so I think there's two reasons. A lot of my time, in the first 90 days of coming on and owning the sales function here for our podcast agency has not been spent, prospecting and doing the front end sales development. It's been working inbound leads and nurturing things that are in the pipeline further down to close. And the first reason is oftentimes our first touch point with new prospective clients is asking them to be a guest on our podcast. And as we've talked about in the past, we get a very high response rate to that, especially when you compare it to traditional cold email. No matter how good the cold email you're writing, when you're asking someone to be a guest on a podcast and delivering value to them before you ever ask anything, obviously the response rate to that is going to be higher than trying to extract value and ask for, a 30-minute discovery call or a demo call or something like that. So I think that first reason is our prospecting built into having our own podcast and inviting potential clients to be guests on our show so that we have a warm introduction to them.
Yeah.
The second thing I think is, the other benefit of the podcast, what I call is, this double-edged sword is, we're almost to 800 episodes. We might be over 800 by the time this airs. I'm losing track a little bit, but our podcast is also the biggest driver of our inbound traffic, whether people reach out to you or me on LinkedIn, they come into the website, they chat with us on Drift on our site. A lot of times people are referencing either B2B growth or they're referencing content that we put out on LinkedIn, which oftentimes is kind of repurposed or related to the content here on this show as well. So it's also, the brand that we've built through our podcast over 2.5 years has really, influenced that inbound engine for us as well. So I think there's two separate reasons, but they're both related to the podcast.
Yeah. So now I want to spend the rest of this episode talking about, okay, so what are we doing about that? We're not having a problem getting that first meeting because, either we're getting folks on the podcast and then it's initiating kind of that first sales conversation after the podcast because we've built a genuine relationship through the course of collaborating with them on our show, or they're coming to us because they've listened to the show, they see our content on LinkedIn, they're coming to us. So we've already had that first meeting, but we're struggling to kind of, okay, how do we progress the conversation forward kind of from that second call onward? So what are you've got actually 3 things here, Logan. Start with this first piece that you're going to start doing to fix the problem that we're having.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the first one is something that I've been thinking about, getting some content from the folks over at Gong and Chris Orlob. And I've heard him talk about this before in that, there's 2 ways to get more deals done. You can either stuff more into your pipeline or you can have better conversations so that you have a higher close rate of the stuff that's already in your pipeline. Obviously, there's benefits to both, but one specific way that I think it was very practical as I was listening to him on the new sales engagement podcast from Outreach was he was talking about this idea of spending time discussing next steps, especially on your first call. If you're in the SaaS space, that's usually a qualification call, maybe before your demo call, or maybe you have kind of a combination of the two. And it really comes down to this idea is, as sales reps, when we have that first call booked, even before we go on that first meeting, sometimes in our minds, the sales cycle has begun. That isn't always the case for our buyers. Oftentimes, as they're going through that first call, they're deciding, do I want to go further with this? Is this valid? Am I on the right track? Do I even really want to consider this vendor further? So thinking about the fact that, you are making the case for not only your product or service, but making the case really to get your prospects into a sales cycle at the end of that first call. They're not automatically in a sales cycle in their mind just because they take that first call for you. And in their mind, they're kind of exploring the opportunity of a sales cycle. So Chris was talking about in this recent episode that I listened to him in that the more time spent discussing next steps, leading your buyer, suggesting next steps, talking about, specific things that they can do or when that next call will be on your first call leads to a higher probability of closed deals. So that's something I've been focusing on because, no matter what your product or service is, that's something that you can implement to have better conversations, even if you're not recording them with Gong or something really sophisticated that way. So that's one thing I've been focusing on.
Yeah. And I think about that a lot too, Logan, in the sense of because you want to be adding value throughout the entire sales process. And I think that is very jargony and okay, what's that really mean? But I think in our context, just kind of brainstorming out loud here, some different things that we could do to add value throughout the sales process would be kind of helping them strategize kind of a direction of their show, possibly a show name, and teasing that out to where that actually doesn't happen on the first call. It happens on the second call. And so by kind of teasing some additional value that we can add to them, I think it would be a way for us to progress from the first call where it's more like discovery, learning about them, learning about what they're wanting to do, and then transitioning into, okay, now that I understand some context, on our next call, I'd love to set up another call to talk more specifically about what your show could look like, what we think, the direction you should take with this, and whether you use us or not, obviously we'd love to produce it for you. But even if they end up not going with us, we've added a tremendous amount of value to them, which I think will actually make them want to go with us even more. So is that kind of how you're thinking about it as well?
Yeah, thinking about giving them ideas on, hey, here's some things you can go back to your team and start discussing. Here are some things we could discuss on the next call, or some things that I could bring to the table. So I've ended some first calls with prospective clients, and we've ended with, okay, let's schedule a next call. But that next call isn't going to be me just asking, hey, are you ready to move forward? It's going to be us bringing some potential show names, some thoughts on themes of the show. So bringing our expertise and putting in some work to bring them some actual value, like you said, getting away from just the buzzword term to actually what does that mean, where the rubber meets the road in the sales process before they ever sign up with us and commit to doing business with us.
Got it. All right. So this next one that you're going to talk about is around kind of the segmentation of your follow-up into different, tiers of accounts. Talk to us about this one.
Yeah. So this is two things kind of influenced me here to start thinking along this track. Going back to that initial conversation where Rex said, you guys have a weird sales problem. He mentioned the 80-20 rule and looking at what is the 80% of the emails that you're sending most often, what's kind of the typical sequence to that. Maybe you can use, because right now I had been doing everything very, very manually. And so he offered a really good suggestion to look at what you're doing. What's kind of the 80%? Maybe you can start with a sequence that is kind of a boiled down version of more or less 80% of what you're doing now. And then, there's still going to be the next thing that I thought about was, as I was listening to John Barros, either on his podcast or maybe when he was interviewed on the Sales Hacker podcast, talking about this idea of segmenting accounts, and kind of the higher tier of the account, the bigger the opportunity, or just the more qualified the opportunity, the more personalization and the more time you should be spending on manual touches rather than, say, an automation sequence. So, in our case, I've thought, looking at kind of A, B, and C level of accounts based on how I feel that first call went. What are some of the qualification criteria? Those sorts of things. So if it's a top level opportunity for you where you really feel like things are progressing, it's a deal that is worth the extra manual touches, and those are going to be most effective, then maybe lean towards the manual side. If it's maybe a B level opportunity where maybe it's not just a perfect fit, it's not totally humming along, you can do some semi automation. And then if you get off that first sales call, it just maybe doesn't seem like a fit, doesn't seem like it's opportunity worth spending a ton of time on very personalized follow-ups, then maybe that's where more you lean toward the automation. Because we all know that every single account we touch, we can't spend half an hour writing every email, because there has to be this balance in your sales activity between quality and quantity. So I think breaking up the opportunities in your pipeline and then seeing where they fall on that spectrum, and let that influence how manual and personalized are you with your follow-up versus how automated you are.
I love it. I love it. All right. This third piece, how we're fixing this problem of kind of progressing beyond the first sales call. How do we push it? We don't have a problem getting that first sales call, but getting the subsequent calls coming after that. How do we push these deals forward? This third one, and the final one that you're going to talk about, Logan, is around really, how to hack creating emails, writing emails quicker. Can you talk to us about this?
Yeah. So obviously anyone in B2B sales and marketing knows a lot about, email templates. We've all seen good ones. We've seen bad ones. We've seen, where quote unquote personalization and email templates have gone wrong. But basically, as I was talking about in those A and B level opportunities where you maybe want to be very personalized, or the B-level opportunities where you kind of want to make it semi-automated, one thing I've done is just use a simple Chrome extension called Auto Text Expander to create snippets. We use the free version of HubSpot. So I think you're limited to 5 snippets that you can create there. So, but if you have, higher level of that tool, maybe that's another option for you. But basically snippets are like little pieces of text or little blocks, a link, a little blurb about this case study, or a link to a blog post, something like that within your email. So find the things that you're typing out consistently, but they're not a full-blown email, because as we said, with those A and B level opportunities, you want to add more personalization, but that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be things that you rinse and repeat. I'm sending people, links to our new episodes in the How to Podcast series. I'm sending them, our PDF guide on the 26 steps to start a podcast and different resources in the content that we've created. So I want to be able to put those in quickly amidst my personalization. So I use some tools to create these snippets where I'm still personalizing it, but I'm not typing out everything manually. So just one thing to think about there, that you don't have to go to completely automated sequences and boilerplate templates to create some semi-automation and some greater productivity where you want to add personalization. So thinking about snippets and blocks of text that you're using consistently might be a way to kind of hack that, and practically how you can approach those A and B level opportunities with some automation.
I love it. Logan, this has been fantastic, man. I think this is going to help a lot of folks. I mean, I know that we're certainly not the only ones that struggle to kind of progress the sales process forward beyond the initial call. I think because of our podcast and because of how we do our prospecting with asking potential customers to be a guest on the show first, I think it alleviates and just gives us a different sales problem than what a lot of folks have. But I know that a lot of folks are crushing it with inbound, and they're going to have a similar problem that we have. They don't have a problem getting that first call, but they do have a problem progressing it forward beyond that first call. And I think you've outlined 3 really tangible things that folks can do to push that forward. So I appreciate you doing that. If you're listening to this and you have not already left a review on B2B Growth within Apple Podcasts, please do that. It is super helpful. I know there's a ton of podcasts that kind of beg and plead for reviews. I don't want to become one of those shows. We barely mention it at all, but it is super important. And if you've been getting value from the show, we would really appreciate you just taking 2 seconds and going to leave a review in Apple Podcasts. It really helps out a lot. And if you're listening to this when it releases on Saturday, I hope you have a fantastic weekend. Logan, man, thank you so much for dropping some knowledge bombs with us here today. And thank you all for listening.
There are lots of ways to build a community, and we've chosen to build the B2B Growth community through this podcast. But because of the way podcasts work, it's really hard to engage with our listeners. And without engagement, it's tough to build a great community. So here's what we've decided to do. We're organizing small dinners across the country with our listeners and guests. No sales pitches, no agenda, just great conversations with like-minded people. We'll talk business, we'll talk family, we'll talk goals and dreams. We'll build friendships. So if you'd like to be a part of a B2B Growth dinner in a city near you, go to b2bgrowthdinners.com. That's b2bgrowthdinners.com. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.